Hello and welcome to our podcast on writing with surprise. This is another podcast in our series of adding voice to our writing. We talk a lot about levels of formality in our writing and how some of these are more appropriate to different audiences. There are certainly times where your purpose for writing may be a little bit more flexible, maybe not in the very strict formal realm of extra formal academic writing, and so you might want to have a little bit more fun with it. Or you might be writing in that academic range and you might want to go ahead and just twist some of the rules for various authorial reasons. And so we have this whole series that we've created for you guys to maybe push you, give you some different things to think about in terms of adding and changing and manipulating some of the voice in your writing. We also wanted to make very clear that most of the items we have on these next couple voice podcasts come directly from the book Spunk and Bite, A Writer's Guide to Bold Contemporary Style. We discovered this a couple years ago, thought there were some great tips and tools in there for adding some variety and voice to our writing. And so we have relatively shamelessly plagiarized a lot of this in order to make our own podcast. So we just wanted to make that known, and that in the event that you were interested in finding out more of where this stuff came from and to read some of the chapters in that book, that we chose not to podcast. So Spunk and Bite, Arthur Plotnick, very fun, easy writing book that you can read. So if you're looking for more, that is a great place to go. So as we mentioned in the previous slide, and as we mentioned throughout all of these voice lesson podcasts, we need to consider when we might want to vary our voice. We have to consider that rhetorical triangle. We have to think about who is our audience. Why are we writing this? And what tone do we want to convey to most effectively communicate our purpose to that audience? If we know we are writing to our parents in order to ask for the car over the weekend, we might want to have a certain angle. If we're just messing around with friends and we want to write something silly, the voice can change. If we're writing for a blog versus a newspaper versus an academic paper versus a scholarship entry, that voice all needs to change based on the purpose and the audience. And so that comes in the form of voice and or tone for what we're talking about. And so you see down there our continuum of fun that we've talked about throughout the year. It's not an exact science. Just because something is less formal doesn't mean that you can't use correct English. You probably still should be using conventional English even in something that's less formal, like maybe a blog or some sort of internet entry. On the other end of that spectrum, we have something that is more formal. Who's to say that you can't be a little bit more informal every once in a while to surprise that reader, to keep them guessing, to keep them on their toes, and just add yourself into the piece a little bit, reveal some of your personality. So the next series of podcasts all kind of go along this idea, but we're always going to come back to this idea of the sliding scale or the continuum of writing formality and that rhetorical triangle. Who's your audience? Why are you writing this? What are you trying to get out of it? And then which voice will be the most appropriate in order to further your purpose for that audience. And so the point of this podcast is the idea of writing with surprise. And so we've titled each of these slides to try and encourage you to think about the words, but also how those might manifest or show themselves in your writing. And so, again, a lot of the wording comes directly from Spunk and Bite. And so if you want to read more, you can always check that out. So for example, we might want to use indirection or misdirection. And so to me, that kind of relates to a basketball move or some sort of sports move. And that's where you fake one way and then reverse for something else. So an example down there, if love is the answer, could you rephrase the question saying, okay, well, great, love's going to be the answer. We're going to talk about love. And then they're going to go ahead and write, well, could you rephrase that? Well, I didn't think they were going there. They faked one way, went around the other way. Nice misdirection for the reader to experience. Another idea, adding the idea of an oxymoron, which is a pair of contradictory terms that create suspense or tension or something like that. Call a character or call a sequence engagingly demented. Oh. Or that there is a deep inconsequence if you don't do something. And so you have this idea of contradictory terms. Well, if it's going to be deep, that means it's going to be very important. And then you say it's inconsequential, meaning not important. So what an interesting clash of terms there to have something that is deeply inconsequential. instead of just saying, yeah, it wasn't important, why not rephrase that when you're working on that editing and revision section of saying deeply inconsequential. Interesting. Creates a nice image in the reader's head. Add the idea of personification or prosopopoeia, the idea of giving life to inanimate or abstract ideas. Oftentimes we see personification in description. The wind walked through the woods, or the metal detector screamed as I walked through it. Okay, well, that's fine. Well, what about this line there? Have a character who's been drinking too much or something. You could say, excuse me, sir, your liver is on the phone. Rather than just saying the character drank too much or he was an alcoholic. Why don't we boil that down and say, give the liver, which is the organ most affected by alcohol, some sort of human qualities, as if the liver is calling, saying, yo, that's enough, back off. It adds a little bit of surprise. Another idea here is the idea of catacosmesis, where we're going to create some surprise by offering statements in descending order of importance. And this is kind of like an ironic statement where you're set up to believe that this is the order of things, and then at the last minute, the writer takes a different turn, so your expectations aren't met. And so we get something like this. I ask for peace, prosperity, and a bagel with cream cheese. And so kind of interesting that you would expect them to be all serious and deep where they're saying, I need peace. Well, that's important. I want prosperity. Absolutely. Everybody wants that. And then, like a bagel, like, could I have one of those too? Interesting. The reader is knocked off guard, somewhat of an ironic twist. You're expecting deep, meaningful things, and at the last second, they juke to the left, and all of a sudden we're asking for a bagel with cream cheese. And so I don't know exactly where you would use this in your writing, how this might come out, but when you are revising your drafts and you're looking for a way to make an impact or keep the voice up and light and fun and lively, maybe consider using something like this to change that a little bit. Another example here is the act of enallage. This is where you're using one part of speech for another. And so the example is grammar. Well, I'll grammar you. Grammar, the word as a part of speech, is a noun. It is a thing. And in this case, they've said, in responding to somebody's question, they're using it as a verb. You're going to grammar somebody. Kind of weird. You can't, grammar people. You could ask them to study grammar. You could encourage them to learn grammar, but you can't actually grammar somebody. And so you have this enallage of moving one part of speech to another. Another way to create surprise is the act of using the understatement. This idea of saying a lot more by saying something less than what is actually happening. Picture the scenario: a character receives a lot of homework. He could just say, yes, I'm very busy tonight. I have a lot to do. I have many assignments to complete, many things to study. Or you could have a character say something like, yeah, it looks like I've got a little to do right now. And so you kind of get that verbally ironic tone. You're understating what you really mean. That yes, I have a ton of stuff to do, but I'm going to understate it by saying, yeah, I've got a little to do. When you truly mean, I have a ton to do. And so that's understatement. And then one more example here of writing with some surprise. We get the idea of neologisms. And you can see from the root of neo that this means something to do with new. And so a neologism is basically an invented word. You are making words. Dr. Seuss did this. Shakespeare did this. We've been able to grasp a bunch of new words whenever authors make a risk and add new words to their own writing. At some point, they tend to be picked up by the general public, maybe even added to the dictionary, things like that. But that is what a neologism is. So for example, you might take the word schmooze, which is kind of like hanging out, just biding your time, hanging out, chatting, catching up on things. Talk show hosts tend to do this. And then there's another word called the bourgeoisie, which is a synonym for, say, the middle class. Well, why can't you put those two together if you have a kind of middle-class group of people that are hanging out, chatting, shooting the breeze, chewing the fat, whatever you want. You could call them the schmoozoisie. Just take those two words and cram them together. Something a little bit more obscure. Who knows if it's a real thing? I mean, it seems kind of weird. I'm not sure why this would ever happen. But how about a parapooch? Combining pooch, which would be a dog, with the word parachute. And so a parapooch becomes a dog dropped by parachute. And so probably a pretty silly example. I'm not sure exactly where you would use this in a narrative or in some sort of academic essay, but why not take that risk? See how it goes. Try to make a new word from something that has been previously non-existent. And so another example of writing with surprise is the idea of moving from one level of formality to another within kind of the structure of the piece. So if you're writing at a very informal level throughout most, then jump to something super formal and stuffy. And vice versa. If you're writing some sort of academically minded paper, change that level of formality for a moment, regain attention, and then move on. As always, with any of these, that may not work. Your audience may not appreciate it. You kind of have to know to whom you're writing. But what a great risk. Try it out. See if it works. See if you are rewarded for it in terms of your audience understanding your message a little bit better. And if so, maybe that becomes part of your arsenal, part of your quiver of creating surprise in writing. So for example, you might have something very formal interrupted by something not formal. I believe I speak for everyone here when I say, huh? I mean, you're totally set up to think that they're going to use some sort of big stuffy words to explain their confusion. Instead, they drop formality and go, huh? Which seems very informal, very slang. The sunbather was a porcelain goddess resting like Venus upon her beach blanket, all the while rocking the dope striped bikini. Okay. Again, we set this up and we have this very stuffy, the sunbather was a porcelain goddess, creating this very conservative image of the beauty of this character. And then you get the, rocking the dope striped bikini. That's pretty informal, very slang, very colloquial. And so by contrasting those levels of formality, you create some nice surprise in your writing. Changes it up a little bit. So that's about it for this one. Again, we're looking at the idea of writing with surprise in mind. Why not? Give it a shot. Vary your voice. Try to capture a different emotion while writing. If you're writing at that super stuffy formal level, try to change diction. Try to add an oxymoron. Try to add some voice to that academic paper. And vice versa. If you're writing in a very informal blog post, jump up a level to a formal voice and see what that does. Again, we have to make these choices based on that rhetorical triangle. It's not just throwing in an oxymoron because we said so. Contemplate your audience, your purpose, your medium, and your tone. What message are you trying to put across? And experiment with these. That's what class is for. Try it out. See if it works. See if it doesn't. And then next time when you're writing something with a little bit more higher stakes attached to it, maybe you're better at it. Maybe you use the same attack this time. Maybe you don't. So that's it for this one. We'll have a couple more in this series, the idea of adding different and changing voices to our writing. Thanks so much for listening. If you have any questions, let us know, and we will see you soon. Thanks.